On December 26, 1900, three lighthouse keepers vanished from the island of Eilean Mòr without leaving a single trace behind. This is the mystery of the Flannan Isles. In the middle of the North Atlantic, three men were tasked with one job: keep the light burning so ships wouldn't smash against the cliffs. But by the time a relief ship arrived, the light had been dark for days and the men were gone. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, and no boats missing. It is a contradiction that defies the basic rules of the sea. You don't just evaporate from a rock surrounded by freezing water. The question we are chasing is how three experienced sailors could disappear from a locked island, and why the state they left the lighthouse in suggests they weren't planning on leaving. And if late-night mysteries like this are your kind of rabbit hole, like the video and subscribe to Sleepwalk Files. Joseph Moore was the first to feel the chill of this mystery. A lighthouse keeper from the Isle of Lewis, Moore had been anxious for 6 days after receiving word that the light on Eilean Mòr had gone dark on December 15th. This was more than a technical failure to him. The men stationed there, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, were his friends. During the voyage on the relief ship, the Hesperus, Moore paced the deck and refused to eat, gripped by a feeling in his gut that something had gone terribly wrong. As the Hesperus approached the east side of the island, the crew noticed the first red flag. On a remote outpost like this, the arrival of a relief ship is a major event. A welcoming party should have been waiting on the landing, and an ensign, the official flag, should have been flying from the flagstaff to signal that all was well. But as Captain James Harvey looked through the mist, the flagstaff was bare. Even the provision boxes, which the keepers were supposed to put out to be restocked, were still inside. The silence coming from the island was oppressive. To break it, Captain Harvey tried to signal the keepers using the ship's equipment. He ordered 3 long, booming blasts of the foghorn to echo across the cliffs. When that didn't work, the crew fired a signal rocket into the gray sky. Normally, the keepers would have responded immediately, but there was nothing. No one waved back from the cliffs, and no one answered the horn. The only sounds were the crashing Atlantic waves and the screaming of seagulls. The implication was clear. The keepers were either dead, incapacitated, or entirely absent from the island. But Eilean Mòr is a fortress of rock with only one way on and one way off. If they had left in a boat, the boat should have been there. If they had been swept away by a wave, there would usually be some sign of a disaster. Joseph Moore didn't wait for a full investigation. He and a crewman named McCormick took the ship's launch and fought the choppy water to reach the east landing. When Moore stepped onto the island, the wind was howling and the rain was battering him, but the island felt unnervingly still. He began the long climb, scaling the 160 stone stairs that lead up the cliff to the lighthouse entrance. When he finally reached the top, he found a scene that didn't make sense. The doors to the lighthouse were shut inside. The lamps were unlit. He walked through the living quarters and they were empty. Lighthouse operation in 1900 followed a strict, almost military set of procedures. The light was never to be left unattended. The keepers rotated shifts with clockwork precision to ensure at least one man was always on watch. For the lamps to be out and the doors to be shut meant the keepers hadn't stepped out for a moment. They had abandoned their posts in a way that contradicted every rule they'd been trained to follow. If they'd been caught in a sudden storm or a freak accident, you'd expect to see the chaos of a struggle or evidence of a hurried exit. Instead, Moore found a place that looked like the inhabitants had simply ceased to exist in a heartbeat. It was as if the island had swallowed them whole. As Moore stood in the silence of the watch room, he realized the mystery was that the men were missing, and the lighthouse itself seemed to be holding its breath. He had come to relieve his friends, but instead, he'd walked into a vacuum. He began to look for any record of what had happened in those final days, a note, a journal, or any clue in the logbook that could explain why 3 men would walk away from the only thing keeping them and other sailors alive. Joseph Moore didn't find any notes or farewell letters. He walked deeper into the living quarters, and that's where the silence started to feel heavy. He looked at the beds, and they were unmade. He looked at the hearth, and the ashes in the fire were cold. Then he saw the wall clock. It had stopped. When a home is lived in, there's a rhythm to it. You wake up, you make the bed, you light the fire to keep the damp out of your bones. But this place looked like the men had evaporated mid-sentence. The stopped clock is the kind of detail that makes you stop breathing for a second. It suggests a moment of freezing. In a normal disappearance, you might expect signs of a struggle or rushed packing. But here, the environment was just suspended. Mòr knew these men. James Ducat, the principal keeper, was a veteran of 20 years. He had a wife and 4 children waiting for him. He wasn't the type of man to leave a fire to go out or a lighthouse to go dark. For the rooms to be in this state, something had to have happened that overrode every instinct and habit these men had. It implies the disappearance didn't happen right before Mòr arrived, but some time ago, leaving the house as a still life of a Tuesday afternoon that never ended. As Mòr moved through the living area, he spotted the clothing pegs on the wall. He saw an oilskin jacket still hanging on its peg. It belonged to Donald MacArthur. You have to understand what an oilskin is. It's a heavy, waterproof coat designed to keep a sailor from freezing or drowning in the rain. This was December in the Outer Hebrides. The weather was atrocious, with howling winds and battering rain that could knock a man off his feet. The boots were gone, which means MacArthur had dressed for a walk, but he had left his jacket. In the North Atlantic winter, walking out into a storm without oilskins is a death sentence. You don't forget your coat when the wind is screaming outside the door. This detail is why people began to doubt the idea of a planned departure. If they had been picked up by a ship or decided to leave the island, they would have taken their gear. If they had walked out for a routine chore, they would have worn their protection. The jacket on the peg suggests a panic. It suggests that whatever happened so fast that MacArthur didn't have 10 seconds to reach for his coat before he was forced or driven out the door. A seasoned keeper like MacArthur fled into a December gale in his shirt sleeves. He wasn't thinking about the weather. He was reacting to something inside that building, something that made the freezing rain outside seem like the safer option. Mòr returned to the ship, the Hesperus, and the crew began a full search of the island. They checked every outbuilding and every nook of the cliffs. They found that the men were truly gone, but as they looked closer at the island's edge, they found physical evidence that didn't fit the story of a simple accident. They found things that suggested a violence far greater than any windstorm. Joseph Mòr started looking for the men's gear. In a place like the Flannan Isles, your clothes are your only defense against the Atlantic. You don't step outside in December without your boots and your oilskins. Mòr checked the quarters and found that the boots for all 3 men, Ducat, MacArthur, and Marshall, were gone. But then he saw something that didn't fit. Hanging right there on the peg in the living quarters was Donald MacArthur's oilskin jacket. In the Outer Hebrides, the wind cuts. It is a freezing, wet cold that can kill a man in minutes if he's soaked. For MacArthur to have his boots on but leave his heavy waterproof jacket behind is almost unthinkable for an experienced keeper. It suggests a departure that was unplanned and panicked. It's the kind of mistake you make when you aren't thinking about the weather because you're thinking about something much more immediate and terrifying. If he had time to put on his boots, why didn't he have the 10 seconds it takes to grab a coat from a peg? Mòr moved from the bedroom into the kitchen, and the scene there added to the feeling of a sudden interruption. He found food sitting on the table, half-eaten. Beside the meal, one of the kitchen chairs had been knocked over, lying on its side on the floor. Mòr entered the kitchen to find a scene that looked like a sudden interruption. The overturned furniture suggests the men stood up in a blind hurry, abandoning their meal instantly. Usually when people leave a post, there's a process. You clean up, secure the room, and make sure the stove is out, but this looked like a snapshot of a moment where time just stopped. It looked as if the men had been sitting down to a meal, heard something, and stood up so fast they knocked over the furniture and walked right out the door. When you put the missing boots and the abandoned jacket together with that overturned chair, a pattern emerges. This wasn't a planned evacuation or a slow descent into madness, it was a reaction. The theory is that something happened inside or just outside those walls that triggered a flight response so strong it overrode their basic survival instincts. They didn't stop to dress for the winter, they just ran. To understand how a group of professional, disciplined men could snap like that, you have to look at the last time they were actually seen. Go back 19 days before Mòr arrived. It was December 7th. A man named Superintendent Robert Muirhead was visiting the islands. As he approached the East Landing, he looked up and saw James Ducat and Thomas Marshall. They weren't hiding or acting strange, they were waving to him from the landing, acknowledging his arrival. Meanwhile, Donald MacArthur was up at the light, performing his duties. Everything was normal. They were alive, they were functioning, and they were in high spirits. This creates a narrow window of time. Between the 7th and the 26th, these three men went from waving at a colleague to vanishing from a locked lighthouse. For nearly 3 weeks, they were alone on that rock. If they had been struggling, or if the lighthouse had failed early on, other ships might have noticed. But the timeline shows they were fine on the 7th, and by the time the relief ship arrived, they were gone. The gap between the waving men on the cliff and the half-eaten food in the kitchen is where the mystery lives. If they were stable and healthy on the 7th, what happened in those following days to make them abandon their posts? The official line says it was a freak wave, a rogue wall of water that swept them off the cliffs while they were working. But that doesn't explain the kitchen. A wave hitting the cliffs doesn't knock over a chair inside a stone building. A wave doesn't make a man forget his jacket while he's putting on his boots. We follow the clue of the overturned chair. The danger might not have come from the sea, but from something that forced them out of the house in a blind hurry. It suggests that whatever took them didn't wait for them to finish their dinner. They may have seen something through the window or heard something at the door that made the freezing wind outside seem safer than staying inside the lighthouse. That leaves the logbooks. If the men had time to write, they would have left a record of the crisis. Mòr found the journals, and as he flipped through the pages, he found entries that didn't match the professional tone of a lighthouse keeper. He found descriptions of weather and emotions that didn't seem to fit the reality of the island. The search for the men didn't stop at the front door of the lighthouse. To figure out when the keepers actually vanished, investigators looked at the shipping logs from mid-December. They found a report from a steamer traveling from Philadelphia to Leith. On December 15th, the captain noticed something that should have been impossible. The lighthouse glow was missing. The building, which sat on the highest point of Eilean Mòr, was completely cloaked in darkness. This narrows the window of the disappearance. The light was gone. Since the relief keeper didn't arrive until the 26th, the lighthouse had been dark for at least 11 days. This means James Ducat, Donald MacArthur, and Thomas Marshall vanished, or the light failed, sometime between December 7th and the 15th. For a man like Ducat, who had 20 years of experience and a family waiting for him at home, leaving the lamp unlit was unthinkable. It was a dereliction of duty that would have been a scandal. The fact that the light went out suggests that whatever happened happened fast, and it happened to everyone at once. But if they had simply walked into the sea or been swept away by a sudden wave, the rest of the island should have looked normal. When the investigators moved their search to the East Landing platform, they found something that didn't fit the image of a simple accident. The landing platform is where supplies are brought from ships. It is a rugged, reinforced area, but the investigators found the iron staircase leading down to it was twisted and damaged. Ropes and jibs, the heavy arms used for hoisting gear, were scattered across the stone. It looked less like the result of a storm and more like the platform had been hit by a violent, concentrated physical force. It's easy to blame the North Atlantic. The weather in December 1900 was atrocious, but investigators noticed the damage wasn't uniform. The stairs weren't rusted or worn. They were bent. In maritime mysteries, this is where the theory of a rogue wave usually comes in. A rogue wave is a massive, spontaneous wall of water, much larger than the surrounding swells. It hits with the force of a falling building. If a wave like that had slammed into the landing, it could have crushed the ironwork and swept the men off their feet in a single second. But as the team surveyed the cliffside near that landing, they found a clue that made the rogue wave theory feel insufficient. Lying on the cliffside was a supply crate, its contents strewn about. Right next to it was a boulder. This wasn't a small stone or a piece of rubble. It was a massive piece of geology weighing at least 1 ton, and it had been displaced from its original position. Moving a 1-ton rock requires an incredible amount of energy. A massive wave can move a lot of water, but the force required to lift and shift a boulder of that size on a cliffside suggests a level of violence beyond a typical storm surge. It implies a force that hammered into the island rather than washing over it. When you put these pieces together, the dark lighthouse, the twisted iron, and the moved boulder, you see a pattern of extreme physical trauma. A local in 1900 might have remembered the old shepherd's stories about Eilean Mòr. They believed the island was home to a malevolent spirit. They used the land to cure diseased animals or help sheep give birth to twins, but they lived by one strict rule: you never stay overnight. Looking at the displaced boulder and the ruined stairs, some people wondered if the keepers had encountered something that didn't belong in a shipping log. If a rogue wave was the answer, the men would have been swept away instantly, but if the force was something else, something that could move tons of rock and twist iron, then the keepers weren't victims of the weather. They were prey. This leaves us with a disturbing image. The 3 men on that landing platform, perhaps trying to secure a crate during a gale, would have seen the water receding or heard a sound that didn't belong in a storm. Whatever hit that platform didn't just take the men, it left a physical scar on the island. The investigators had found physical evidence of a struggle, but they still didn't have a motive or a sequence of events. They had the how, a massive force, but not the why. To find that, they had to go back inside and look at the only thing the men had left behind: the logbooks. When they read the final entries, the weather reports started to sound less like meteorology and more like a descent into panic. The investigators from the Northern Lighthouse Board didn't stop at the living quarters. They moved outside, scanning the rugged terrain of Eilean Mòr for any sign of a struggle or an accident. High up on the cliffside, they found patches of turf ripped clean out of the earth. This wasn't a few loose clumps of grass. The soil and vegetation had been torn up and dragged backward for at least 30 feet. Wind can do a lot of damage when a storm hits a coast, but this looked different. It looked like something had grabbed the land and pulled it. For turf to be dragged that far, water or wind would have had to surge up the vertical face of the cliff with extreme velocity. It would have been a wall of water or a blast of air moving with enough force to peel the island's skin back. Some people at the time, those who leaned into old folklore, suggested this was the work of a sea serpent or a malevolent spirit. When you're standing on a remote rock in the Hebrides and you see a ton-weight boulder displaced and the ground shredded, ordinary explanations can feel thin. If a wave had been that powerful, it wouldn't have just taken the men, it would have scrubbed the cliff clean. The investigators weren't looking for monsters though, they were looking for a timeline. They went back inside and focused on the lighthouse logbooks, the official records where the keepers noted everything from oil levels to weather patterns. They flipped through the pages until they hit an entry dated December 12th. The entry was written by Thomas Marshall, the youngest of the 3. He was only 28 and didn't have the decades of experience that the principal keeper, James Ducat, possessed. In his handwriting, Marshall described severe winds. He wrote that they were experiencing storms the likes of which he had never seen. This means the men weren't caught in a sudden flash flood or a freak accident. They'd been living through a sustained, violent atmospheric event for days before they disappeared. They were awake, they were documenting it, and they were clearly shaken by the intensity of the weather. This creates a contradiction. If the weather was that bad, why would 3 experienced men, Men who knew the dangers of the North Atlantic all leave the safety of the lighthouse at the same time, especially when one of them, Donald MacArthur, left his oilskin jacket hanging on its peg. In the dead of a Scottish winter, walking out into a storm without a waterproof coat is a death sentence. If they were terrified by the winds Marshall described, the logical move would be to barricade the doors and wait it out. Instead, the evidence suggests a panic, a knocked-over chair, half-eaten food, and boots missing from the room. It looks like they saw something outside, something so urgent that it overrode their training and their survival instincts. The logbook tells us the storm was there, and the shredded turf tells us the ocean reached the cliffs. But there's a gap between the wind and the vanishing. If the storm was the killer, why did the lighthouse stay dark for days before anyone noticed? And more importantly, if they were swept away by a rogue wave, where are the bodies? On an island this small, a body eventually washes up or gets caught in the rocks. But the Flannan Isles remained empty. To understand how 3 men could simply vanish, you have to look at who they were. These weren't rookies. James Ducat, the principal keeper, had spent 20 years in the service. In 2 decades of facing some of the worst weather on Earth, he had rarely, if ever, made a mistake. He was a man with a wife and 4 children waiting for him back home. He knew the rules of the light. He knew that leaving a lighthouse unmanned was a failure of duty and a death sentence for any ship passing by in the dark. Then there was Donald MacArthur. He was 40, experienced, and also had a family. Only the youngest, Thomas Marshall, was a bit of a wild card at 28. But even he was under the command of a veteran like Ducat. When you look at those profiles, the idea that they just forgot a safety protocol or wandered off in a moment of confusion falls apart. Incompetence doesn't explain this. A simple mistake doesn't make 3 professional sailors disappear into thin air. If they left the lighthouse, they did it for a reason that overrode 20 years of instinct and discipline. The island itself had a reputation that made people doubt the official reports from the start. Long before the lighthouse was built, shepherds brought their flocks to Eilean Mòr. There were stories that the island possessed a strange, healing power, that it could cure a sick animal or help a sheep give birth to healthy twins. But those same shepherds followed one absolute rule: you never stay overnight. They believed the island was home to a malevolent spirit, something that didn't want humans claiming the land. When Joseph Moore stepped into that silent lighthouse and saw the cold ashes in the hearth, those old superstitions felt less like folklore and more like a warning. For the people living in the Outer Hebrides, the idea of a spirit taking the men wasn't a ghost story. It was a plausible explanation for why a man like Ducat would vanish without a word. If something unnatural had come for them, the rules of the lighthouse wouldn't have mattered. If we look at the physical wreckage, a more grounded, though no less terrifying picture emerges. Consider the clues left behind. There was one oilskin jacket, MacArthur's still hanging on its peg. In the dead of a Scottish winter, no one goes outside without a coat, unless they don't plan to be outside for long. They likely thought they were just stepping out for a second. Then there's the damage at the landing. The iron staircase leading down to the platform was twisted and bent. The ropes and jibs of the crane were scattered across the rocks, as if something had hammered them with incredible force. A boulder weighing at least a ton had been shoved out of place, and nearby thick chunks of turf had been ripped from the earth and dragged 30 feet across the ground. Those pieces suggest a sequence of events. A massive storm hits. The men see something wrong at the landing. Maybe a supply crate is sliding away or the crane is failing. They rush out. MacArthur is in such a hurry, he doesn't even grab his jacket. They fight the wind to secure their gear, thinking they are safe on the cliffside, and then the North Atlantic does what it does best. A rogue wave, a wall of water far larger than the surrounding swells, hits the cliff. These waves can carry the weight of a skyscraper and hit with the force of an explosion. That would explain the twisted iron, the displaced ton of rock, and the torn turf. In a single heartbeat, the water would have swept over the landing, pulling Ducat, MacArthur, and Marshall straight off the island and into the freezing depths. The ocean doesn't leave evidence or bodies. It swallows everything and settles back into a calm blue surface. In this scenario, there is no mystery, only a tragedy. The men didn't abandon their posts. They were erased by the very element they spent their lives watching. But that explanation leaves one detail. If they were swept away in a sudden surge, why was a chair knocked over in the kitchen? Why was there half-eaten food on the table, as if they had been interrupted in the middle of a meal? A rogue wave at the landing doesn't knock over a chair inside a stone lighthouse. It suggests the danger didn't come from the sea, but from something that had already made its way inside. You enjoyed this episode? Subscribe to Sleepwalk Files to stay up to date with new mysteries and long videos to fall asleep to every night.